Is the IRS Whistleblower program a complete waste of time? Maybe. Okay. Now, I've had some really great experiences with the whistleblower program, and I've had cases where I don't know what the hell happened. So, in this week's podcast, I've invited on Bryan Skarlatos, who is the managing partner at Kostelanetz LLP in New York. They have offices in New York and Washington. Bryan has practiced longer than I. He is at the top of our profession, someone that I have looked up to, and I've tried to do a lot of things that he's done. So having him on the program is just actually, it's really a great honor. But he has also had some really interesting situations and experiences with the whistleblower office. So what we're going to do in this week's podcast is break down for you what we think's work, what doesn't work, when is this a complete waste of time, and when should you maybe consider bringing that whistleblower case, and what do you need to know about it before you actually hit the send on that Form 211. All right. So let's go meet Bryan and get into it. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this week's Tax Rep Network podcast. I'm Eric Green. I'm joined by Bryan Skarlatos. Bryan is at Kostelanetz in New York. Now, I have a long history with Bryan because, and I don't know if I've ever told Bryan this, when I kind of started my practice, advice I was given is look at the people who are doing what you want to do and do what they do. And so Bryan, Chuck Rettig, Steve Tosher, and so, the NYU Tax Controversy Forum that Bryan founded 14 years ago, 15 years
Oh,
ago.
no, 17 years ago now.
17
We're all
years.
that much older, Eric.
Yeah. IRS Rep Conference, right? I basically copied. And so I've kind of been following Bryan from the back row for quite a while, but no, and it's been great that last several years that you and I actually have gotten to actually work together and gotten to know each other better. But if you aren't familiar with Kostelanetz, they're probably one of the premier firms that do controversy work in the country. They do what we do, they just do it much larger and frankly, in a much bigger market than we do. You're doing international and criminal. You can Google Bryan and he comes up in a lot of famous cases. So, it's great for you taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Eric. And I'll tell you, the world turns and now I watch what you do and I learn from you. So, that's the way the world works.
I guess so, and it's a lot smaller than you thought. But so one of the things I wanted to talk about, obviously, is the whistleblower, the IRS whistleblower program. And I know because I have vented to you, I've heard your stories. You've ended up litigating a bunch of these. So the question really is, because we get people who call us all the time, I'm sure you do too. So it's always like, should I bring a whistleblower case? The bigger question, Bryan, for us today, is it worth even bringing a whistleblower case? And if so, what circumstances would you look for before you decided to take a case? I have very strong feelings about this, but I mean, we can get into that. But just quickly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have some strong feelings about it too. And, Eric, you've asked two questions. Is it even worth bringing a case? And if so, under what circumstances would you bring a case? And so why don't I jump in and sort of explain a little bit what I do? I do have a whistleblower practice, or I have had a whistleblower practice over the last 20 years, because the IRS whistleblower statute was enacted in 2006. So we're coming up on 20 years next year. It was enacted by Senator Grassley. And I know, because I've been into the legislative history, I've testified at the IRS on this, and I've actually represented Senator Grassley as an amicus, an appeal of a whistleblower case. I know that he did it with the best intentions to make it like the False Claims Act, to like the FCA. So I've been doing this for a long time. But the whistleblower practice is really just a small part of my practice. The largest part of what I do is representing taxpayers against the IRS. Now, I will say in many of those cases, some of them, there are whistleblowers on the other side, and I have to deal with representing the taxpayer when somebody's blown the whistle against the taxpayer.
Right.
And my knowledge of the whistleblower program and what works, what doesn't, how the IRS reacts to it has really helped me in representing the taxpayers on that side. And that is the much larger part of my practice. But I believe in the whistleblower program. I think it can be an important part of IRS enforcement because it's tough for the IRS to figure out all the non-compliance that may be out there and to uncover it. If you really, really think about it, the IRS has a lot of power and nobody wants the harsh spotlight of the government shown on them. But the IRS really doesn't know your financial affairs or my financial affairs. And they have to go through this whole audit to figure it out. They've got to pull the information out of us. And especially if I am a large, sophisticated, complex, big dollar taxpayer, that can be really tricky for the IRS. But then also, there are plenty of other taxpayers out there. They just don't know where they're not. They have a sense. I mean, listen, an IRS agent can walk down the street and say, that restaurant has this much cash. Those people are off the books. Those are relatively smaller matters. But to go out and really pinpoint where the non-compliance is, it's hard for them to do. And there is a role in that process for the whistleblower program. So I do think it's an important part of IRS enforcement. And who knows, going forward with everything that's happening at the IRS, maybe it will take a more central role in how the IRS develops cases. But getting back to your question, and you just cut me off if I talk too much.
Right, enough.
But getting back to your question, would I take a whistleblower case now? Well, I am in my early 60s, and IRS whistleblower cases take a long, long time.
Right.
And listen, if I was doing it as part of my estate planning, maybe. But I'm going to tell you, I have one case that we're still litigating in the Court of Federal Claims in the appeals court, and that case started, I think, around 2007. So it's coming up on 20 years when the claim was made, and it involves years pre that, so the early 2000s. That case is still being litigated by us against the IRS on behalf of the whistleblower.
Yeah.
20 years. I mean, so the average whistleblower case, I think, is taken 8 to 10 years to pay out. And those are for ones that pay out.
Right.
For ones where the IRS wants to drag its feet or doesn't want to pay out, and you have to take them to court, you're looking at, I would say 12 to 20 years minimum.
Right. And
so do I want to take a case now?
Yeah.
It better be a simple, easy case. We'll come to that in a minute.
Well, yeah, we're going to get to that. So for the folks listening, why does it take so long? So let's think about this. All right. Someone comes and meets with me. We don't just fill in the form and fax it off. So the whistleblower office, statistically, they get 1,000 cases a month. They have, before DOGE, they had 32 people, last I checked, reviewing this. So they have 30 to review, 30 to 35 each every single month. New. So here's the thing. If you don't grab their attention and provide something that they think they can latch onto, meaning if you're just giving them, I believe this person's cheating, that's going nowhere.
That's out.
The time, yeah, and they don't have an unlimited staff, forget about it. So one, we're going to weed through and we're going to poke and prod to see, do we think, if I'm on the government side, do I think there's something here that I would send to audit, civil audit or criminal, to say, hey, look at this. So one, we want to provide as much as we can. So there's going to be some time you're going to spend with us. We're going to submit it. The whistleblower office needs to look at it. Assuming you've convinced them there's something there, it then goes off to usually a civil function, could go to criminal, for them to review. It's now just another case in their inventory. They need to work it. A normal audit could take anywhere from a year to year and a half minimum. By the way, the guy on the other side, or gal, the target, they're usually not going to sit down. So some of these real big cases I filed, I always tell the client, assuming the government does pursue this, they're not going to just straight, write a check. They're going to go hire Bryan, who's going to now start, fighting the other way.
Oh, and by the way, that audit that takes a year or two, they hire me, and now it takes 3 to 4.
Right. Then there's appeals. Then there may be, because remember something, if you're truly the target, they usually don't like the idea of paying. And so they're going to end up fighting this. They're going to generally hire someone on the other side. So if all goes well, 5-6 years down the road, now the government's got to collect. Well, there's a 10-year collection statute. Maybe the client strokes a check, or maybe they get into a payment plan, or maybe they file an offer in compromise and get rid of it. You only collect if the government collects. So, that's where that 8 to 10 comes in. Now, like Bryan has had cases where they're litigating, and you just add that on top. So this is not a get rich quick scheme. In fact, if anything, it's a lottery ticket that may someday pay you something, maybe. So you got
And you're not going to know, you're not going to have any sense of how it's going throughout the process either. That's what drives me crazy. It drives people crazy.
right. Oh, it's very frustrating. And you check in with the government, and all they'll do is send you that standard letter saying it is active.
Right. So, Eric, why don't we what you said really highlights a lot of issues in this process. And I think what's important for people to understand is that the IRS isn't one sort of department or one set of people. When you're filing a whistleblower claim, as you pointed out, you file it with the whistleblower office. And at some point, you have to file with the whistleblower office. And that is an office of maybe 40 approximately people. They're really sort of a clearinghouse. They do review it, but they're not going to work it and determine whether it's a good case or a bad case. What they do is they take a look and see whether you've crossed all your I's, dotted all your T's, whether you're a prohibited whistleblower, whether it meets certain standards, and whether it seems like there's something to follow up on. If that gets a green light, then they send it to a completely separate part of the IRS, the field. So it goes to small business self-employed, or it goes to LB&I, but it goes to revenue agents in the field. And that's where you said, Eric, they receive it, and then they've got to decide when are they going to pick it up and work it.
Yep.
And I do think one of the biggest issues with the IRS and the way they handle whistleblower cases is that the revenue agents don't seem to be. I've heard from senior people at the IRS, no, Bryan, you're wrong. They do appreciate whistleblower claims, but for whatever reason, they've got their own inventory. They've got their own audit plans. They already know what they're doing over the next 6 months to 12 months. They get a whistleblower case. How do they fit that into their inventory, and do they work it? I'm going to tell you my firm belief, because they don't tell me anything, and we're going to get to that in just a moment, why they don't tell us anything. But my firm belief, based on my experience over the last 20 years, is that most agents do not jump all over a whistleblower claim. They just don't, no matter how good it is. And also, no matter how big it is. I can't tell you how many whistleblowers have come to me and said, this is the biggest whistleblower claim ever. Or this is, $100 million or $500 million or $20 billion claim. And I have many billion-dollar claims in my life. None of them have paid, but I've had many billion-dollar claims filed. Bigger is not better. I'll say it again. Bigger is not better.
Yeah, well,
Because there's a lot that goes on at the IRS to deal with a really big claim, and you're going to get into a very complex process. And so I just want to make that clear. You were going to say?
And also, one, I have discovered, if it is complicated, these bigger cases, if it is big, it's complicated. The IRS does not have a crack team of people sitting around waiting to work your case. The cases that I've had that have paid have been these small income tax evasion that is very simple for the government to make. And I found the same thing even with DOJ. They're not looking to make complicated RICO type. No. If it's a straight up income tax evasion that they can get a plea deal on, that they're interested in. It feels to me like the rest of America, they don't have the patience for anything complicated. And, again, I have $2 billion whistleblower cases. I've got one that's about 50, 60 million. And then I got these two, there were restaurants with people off the books. One of which they did, and it appears the person just closed out the audit and is paying. The other one, to get to your point, the auditor must have gotten it, and it was one of these where there are 5 people on the books and 15 people off the books. So literally, auditor just shows up one evening for dinner. You could just count the number of people and look at the payroll. That got closed as a no change audit. My client got pissed. You need to get them to. I'm like, no. And that, which is the other thing I want to point out. This is done purely at the discretion of the government. The government doesn't like the case. The government can't be bothered. It's not big enough or too complicated. Or frankly, they just don't feel like doing it. Or you have an
or
auditor
they're
lazy.
too busy.
Yeah,
Busy.
they don't do it. One, you cannot compel them. And two, you only collect what they collect. So if one of my $1 billion cases they actually pursue and the person ended up gambling everything away and now they're broke and they do an offer and compromise for $100, that's what the government collected. And so
Yeah.
it really can be very frustrating because, people come in and, oh, it's a big case, and they're doing the math in their head. Well, if the government gets 35% tax, you have a 75% civil fraud penalty. So the government's going to collect 80 million and they're going to give me 30% because I'm a genius. And so there's 24 million I'll get, and I got to pay you something, Eric. But, and they're like retiring to Monaco or wherever in their head. And, yeah, no, come back to earth. It's 10 years
Yeah.
out. If the
My,
government,
my my thoughts are $100 million plus cases they're going to face some headwinds and frictions at the IRS just because of potentially the complexity and the difficulty of that. Maybe you're dealing with the taxpayer who's going to be well funded and have a very strong defense.
Mhm.
So I think the best sweet spot for a whistleblower claim is going to be in the 10 to $50 million range, or maybe a little smaller, $10 to $25 million range. Now, you get so small that if it's, $5 or $6 million, then is it really worth putting a lot of time and effort in to wait 10 years to get, 20 to 30%
Yep.
of that award? So you really have to think about that too, and the work that goes into it, and, the need to pay professionals to do some of that. And you touched on one of the things, Eric, and I think we should really talk to the folks about this. And it has to do with an inherent tension in the whistleblower program that, I think needs to be worked out, perhaps via statute. And there is, by the way, a bill pending in Congress. It has bipartisan support to revamp the whistleblower program a little bit. We should certainly talk about that before our time is up. But here's the main issue in the inherent tension. One is, as we talked about, it's going to take a long, long time. There are systemic reasons for that. There are also reasons because the taxpayer has the right to contest and to fight back, which often they do. And that can stretch things out for quite a while. So number two, the big issue is during that long period, you don't hear anything about your claim. And there's a reason for that. It's taxpayer confidentiality, section 6103. And I said there was a tension in the statute, and there is. The tension is that the whistleblower program encourages people to come forward with information, provide it to the IRS. Sometimes these whistleblowers are doing it at risk to themselves. There can be fear of physical risk, although I have to say that's a small minority of cases. But sometimes it's people who have worked in the industry, who work for somebody, work for a corporation. And so they're doing it at risk to their livelihood, certainly. And then they're also taking their time and effort, et cetera, to do this. So, they encourage them to do this, and that the whistleblower program, relies on the information from the whistleblower. And sometimes that should be an iterative process where the IRS comes back and asks the whistleblower questions about what they've submitted. But that does not happen. Why? Because of section 6103, taxpayer confidentiality. Taxpayers have the right to confidentiality, which is very, very important. At the same time, the IRS, if the IRS is seeking to push a case forward, they will define the boundaries of taxpayer confidentiality one way. However, when it comes to whistleblowers, they define the boundaries of confidentiality very, very broadly, such that they can't even say something to you which would possibly allow you to infer what was happening with the taxpayer. It gets really ridiculous. Anything that would allow you to even guess where the case is in the process, they say, oh, we can't do that because then you could guess where the case is in the process. However, in other situations, the IRS really they're not worried about people guessing based on their signals. They're not worried about taking actions from which somebody could infer what is happening with the taxpayer. So they define the boundary of 6103 very, very broadly, which is very frustrating because what happens is in any case that involves any complexity, you make the whistleblower submission, and then it's up to the IRS to sort of interpret your information and use it. And they would get so much further if they could come back and work with the whistleblower and ask some questions, or say, you know what, we got this information from the IRS or the taxpayer, excuse me, or the taxpayer says this, what would the response be? And oftentimes the whistleblower is, as soon as they tell me what the taxpayer says, I'll tell you what the response is. No, there's not that kind of back and forth because they're afraid that if they involve the whistleblower in that process, the whistleblower will be able to infer that the IRS is auditing the taxpayer, that where they stand in the audit, what's happening in the audit. And so they keep you in complete darkness during this 5 to 10 year period. And
Well,
that's super frustrating.
and so one of the workarounds I've had, which is very limited, is if somebody comes and they bring a case, and it's a good criminal case,
If it's a criminal case, you can work around this sometimes.
I will go right to my special agents that I'm friends with, present it to them, because when you file the 211, which is the whistleblower form, they say, "Have you provided this to anyone in the IRS?" So I always use one of my local special agents, which does annoy them a little bit because now they get the whistleblower office calling them. But one of them actually told me years ago, he's now since retired, but he told me, said, "You know what, Eric, I know you want to file the 211. By all means, do that. Let me see the case. I don't like the idea that these people in Utah are making a decision. I want to see it." But what I have found is now I can contact them. Now, again, they won't say, "Oh, you know what, Eric, here's what's going on with that." That they won't do. But they have actually interviewed my client. So there is a little bit at the beginning where we can provide and expand. They also sometimes, I told you I had one where it was the CFO that was the whistleblower.
Mhm.
They got a legal opinion about their exposure, this company. They brought in the DOJ lawyers by phone. Was this prepared as part of litigation? Meaning, is there an argument it's attorney-client privilege, which means we can't do anything with it? And there was no lawsuit going on. There was no legal action. They just went and sought an opinion from this accounting firm. But by going to CI, we can get a little bit of that. But you're right. Once it goes off into the program, even my connection, all they can do is say, "I made a call. It's active."
Yeah.
That's all.
There's two comments I want to make to what you said. First, you're right. That is an exception to what I just said to a degree, a limited degree, as you
Agree.
pointed out. And the key is, I've thought about this a lot and I've experienced it. The key here is that the criminal investigation side of the IRS is much more used to working with witnesses and informants and that sort of thing. So they're not afraid. They're not afraid to reach out and talk to an interview, for example, or even in some cases come back and ask more questions. Whereas the civil side of the IRS is concerned about that for whatever reason. And I think because they're afraid of an expansive interpretation of Section 6103, but there is a workaround to that as well. So for that reason, I agree with you. In the right case, Eric, it is better to bypass the whistleblower office, go directly to IRS CI, and then before CI actually takes action, lodge your claim with the whistleblower office to make sure that you have the ability to get the award. Because if you don't lodge it with the whistleblower office, you're not going to get an award.
Right.
But you go to IRS CI first to try to get some traction in the right kind of case. Now, I want to talk about the regular case. What can you do with 6103? There's actually a section of 6103, 6103N, I believe, that allows the IRS to enter into contracts with agents to exchange information. And the IRS does this. They do work with agents all the time. When I say agents, I mean that third-party contractors they actually in some cases have hired law firms to help them with various situations. They can enter into contracts where the agent is bound by 6103 to the same degree the government is, with the same penalties for violating 6103, which includes a criminal prosecution or monetary penalties. So the whistleblower and the whistleblower's representatives take on all those burdens, but they're governed by 6103 too, so that disclosure of some even small amount of information in appropriate cases so that you can have the iterative process, the back and forth would work. That's something that the IRS should use more often. And that would bring it closer to Grassley's original intent to make it like the Foreign Corrupt Practice. The FCA, False Claims Act, to make it like the False Claims Act, where we see the Department of Justice working more closely with claimants under the FCA than the IRS has ever done in the last 20 years. So the workaround there is make it more like the FCA, work more closely with the whistleblowers, use 6103N when appropriate. And then what does the IRS do? There've been complaints about this for a long time. So the IRS has said, well, what we'll do is we will report out to the claimant, the whistleblower, once a year upon request what's going on with the case. And that's become known as a status and stage letter.
Right.
But the status and stage letter has been interpreted so narrowly that all it is, yes, we still have your claim.
Yeah.
And they will say one other thing. It's still out in the field being worked. or it's at the whistleblower office being reviewed. So they'll tell you that. And that is, it's better than nothing,
Yep.
but you only get one a year. And once a year, you get to find out they're still in the field or it's at the whistleblower office being worked. That's all you get.
Because of time to kind of wrap this up. Oh, by the way, so Lee Martin used to be the director of the whistleblower office. I think Lee's retired a number of years ago,
Yes.
but he and I gave a talk and I added a slide. Do you remember the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark where they're wheeling the Ark off into a government warehouse? I said, that's what it feels like. You send this in and it goes off somewhere. Lee got so pissed at me. He's like, no, that's not true. We work every blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, first of all, calm down. First of all, I have a bigger issue. I probably have a royalty violation or something, because I had a picture from the movie, which I didn't get rights to. But anyway, I think the lesson, if you're listening to this, is it worth bringing a whistleblower claim? Yes, if one, it is a case that can easily be worked, meaning it's not an appraisal or evaluation battle or anything like that, where you battle of the experts, the government's not going to do. I can tell you that right now. I mean, if they can get an expert on the other side saying it's not an issue, what is a jury going to do with that? So, one, that it's straightforward. Two, if you think it's the biggest case ever, that should be concerning. Now, it's possible you have the biggest straight up income tax fraud ever. But the moment it starts getting complicated, our experience, as you've taken from this, is you're going to have a hard time getting the government to work that. If it's far-flung and complicated, it's going to be hard from a resource perspective to get them to do this. And the other thing, honestly, is if all you've got is an allegation, no good. I would like to see something that supports this. And here's the other thing that people should understand. Even like that CFO that brought us all that stuff I told you about, the IRS has to independently verify all that. They can't work a case based on, Eric Green's client gave us this, must be good. So they're going to try to independently verify everything that we give them, or figure out some other way to prove it, which also can be frustrating where we've got inside info we can give them. They can't just rely on that. They've got to figure out another way to work this case because they've got to be able to support that. So it can be very frustrating. And also, as Bryan pointed out, understand that this is going to be, you're in for the long haul. This is a lottery ticket that might pay 10 to 20 years from now, if at all.
So I think what you were just answering your second question at the outset, which is what is a good claim?
Yep.
And so I think a good claim is one that's, it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, not too small, but not too big either. And so you don't want the biggest claim ever. It's a claim that ideally would involve clear-cut tax evasion. And what we're saying there is a criminal case, one where you have strong evidence of that somebody knew what they were doing was wrong, of tax fraud. And then because then you want to go to the criminal side of things where you get more traction as opposed to just dumping it into the civil audit file side of things. And then you're going to have really good evidence, really good. And that's where, somebody like Eric or my office can help you vet the claim and determine whether you have good evidence. And then you've got to be willing to wait. Yes.
And you have to be willing to understand and hope the government already doesn't have similar information somewhere, because if they somehow can argue they already have the info, thank you very much, but you're not getting paid.
Now, I'll tell you then on the flip side, if you ever are involved with an audit where you believe there's a whistleblower on the other side, you can also work some of these aspects of the program to your benefit. There are ways to talk to the IRS agents, whether they're criminal agents or revenue agents on the civil side, about the issues with the whistleblower and also issues regarding 6103, and including grand jury secrecy as well under Rule 60 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. So you can use the information that we've been talking about now to your benefit when you're representing taxpayers who have whistleblowers on the other side. Not that the IRS doesn't tell you there's a whistleblower, but you can often know. And also just having been on both sides, Eric and I are able to sense when there's a whistleblower on the other side. And then you adjust how you present your case to the IRS given that funnel of knowledge that you believe they're getting from the whistleblower. So it helps to know on both sides what's going on with the whistleblower program. Eric, if I may, can I just talk about some of the changes that are pending before Congress?
Yeah, though, I was just going to have one comment. I actually had a case. We knew who the whistleblower was. It was the former bookkeeper. And during the audit, what we discovered is my client was arguably pocketing money, skimming money. So was their whistleblower.
There you go.
And so all of a sudden, the criminal case ended up going away because now it became muddy. Who was the criminal? And which, by the way, just as an aside, and I do want Bryan to, talk about the new legislation. Just because you're the whistleblower doesn't mean you get a get out of jail free card. Look at
No.
Mr. Feld. He blew the whistle on UBS, got 104 million or whatever he got, and got 40 months in prison for participating.
Yeah, and he got the prison first, by the way. Then he got the money afterwards.
He got the money afterward. So it all worked out.
So so it can blew back, and I do agree. There are important ways. Once you intuit there's a whistleblower on the other side, there are a lot of things you can do to, and I would say in a large portion, maybe at least half, if not more, of my criminal cases, there's a whistleblower on the other side or a cooperator, whether they're filing for a whistleblower, but there's a cooperator. And, we know how to work with those folks and how to argue the case to the IRS to say, don't rely on what the whistleblower is telling you. And that just shows you, some of the frictions that you can encounter as a whistleblower. So there is a bill pending before Congress, and that would change the whistleblower statute in some important ways. The first is right now, just so you know, the whistleblower office determines whether to pay an award and the amount of that award. And that review by the whistleblower office, it's reviewed by the tax court only on an abuse of discretion standard, which means that the whistleblower office has complete discretion. And only if you can show that what they did was abusive or clearly erroneous would anybody ever reverse them. And so what that means is that they know they've got that protection. So there's a bill pending that says change it to de novo standard. So the tax court can review the case de novo and substitute its judgment for whether you should pay or how much the award should be, as opposed to just seeing whether the people below abuse their discretion.
Right.
So if that standard is changed, then the whistleblower program may open up quite a bit, one would hope. And then another thing that's super important is that the statute has a provision that after a certain amount of time, after the IRS has collected some money, that interest begins to run on the whistleblower award. And what that does is that really forces the whistleblower office to move expeditiously in paying claims. And on that point, there is also a policy that the IRS needs to implement better, and that's partial payment. Because what the whistleblower office does is it waits till it collects every last red cent that's due, and then it waits 2 more years for the statute of limitations on a claim for refund to expire before they'll even process your claim. And so that all works into these long delays, because there could be cases where they assess tax and then it takes them 5 years to collect. And then they wait 2 years after that 5 years, and they may have collected 90% of the money in year one. The last 10% over the last 4 years, you're waiting the whole 5 years till every cent is collected. And what the whistleblower office should be able to do is pay throughout the process. And I know that puts burdens on the IRS, but really the whistleblower process is broken, and this is one way to fix it.
Yeah, even if they waited the 2 years, so after they collect in year one, after year 3, they can pay that piece of it out. So even if you get a rolling annuity.
Yeah.
No, I get it. Well, listen, Bryan, thank you for joining me for commentary. I will put a link to Bryan's email below if you have a case, controversy,
or just questions.
Yep, just questions. And thank you all for listening. Bryan, again, thanks for doing this. And everyone have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next week on the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. And I'll keep following you.
All right, take it easy.
Bye-bye.